Good morning, and thank you for staying with us here at I-24 News. This is the morning edition. We're on a special broadcast this morning. It is the 20th day of Operation Protective Edge. A humanitarian truce was unilaterally ended by Hamas last night when it resumed rocket fire, although Israel said it agreed to hold its fire for another 24 hours. This morning, in the latest barrage, which took place in the early hours of this morning, sirens sounded in the Sharon and Shfela regions, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gan Yavne, and towns and villages on the Gaza periphery. A Hamas spokesman responded to the Israeli extension by saying that any ceasefire that doesn't ensure the IDF pulls out of Gaza and the evacuation of the injured is not acceptable. An Israeli Defense Force soldier was killed early this morning by a mortar shell near the Gaza border, and 2 other Israeli soldiers died who were previously injured in the fighting. They died of their wounds last night. The latest deaths bring the IDF death toll to 43. With the Gaza death toll said to reach over 1,000, Israeli military sources are noting that several hundred Hamas gunmen are among those that have been killed. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry headed back to Washington after Israel rejected his ceasefire proposal. And we will go and expand on that in the coming segment. With me now in studio is security intelligence expert Yossi Melman. Thank you, Yossi, for joining us.
Good morning.
I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev, thank you for being here. And senior defense correspondent from Haaretz, Amir Oren. Amir, let's start with you. We do have an update now. Israel did agree to 24 hours, but has now decided to resume its fighting.
Yes, the IDF spokesman has just announced that Israel is back on the offensive, that offensive operations are to be resumed. Perhaps they are already undergoing as we are speaking now. And as the spokesman said, it is going to be on the ground, in the air, and from the sea on all fronts because Hamas abused the so-called humanitarian window. The IDF spokesman is against the use of the word truce or ceasefire. He insists that this is just a humanitarian window in order to help the population. Hamas has abused it for the last 14 hours since last night. And so obviously the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister have authorized the IDF to resume its fighting. But while this is going on, the political track is still undergoing. Right. And this is not the end of it.
Tal, of course, to take us back into the behind the scenes of the decisions that have been made over the weekend. Yes, the IDF, the Israeli Security Cabinet did decide to agree to a 12-hour ceasefire. They extended it by 4 hours and then by 24 hours. Take us through those steps.
Well, let's go a bit back. We're talking about Friday evening. That was a very dramatic Security Cabinet meeting, which convened at about 4 o'clock to start and discuss the Kerry proposal for ceasefire. It was a very tense meeting. There were a lot of breaks in the middle, but in the end, the Israeli cabinet decided that the Kerry proposal that was put on the table is not good enough, and it wants to continue negotiations. There was again, for the umpteenth time, some kind of miscommunication with the U.S. Secretary of State. We saw him in a press conference on Friday in Cairo, kind of squibbling, trying to explain exactly what happened. It was clear there's a big problem of communications between Israel and the U.S. regarding this whole ceasefire effort. And when you speak to Israeli officials in the past 24, 48 hours, the way they describe Kerry is unprecedented. They are a lot of bad words are attributed to him and his efforts to try and he was trying, of course, coming and trying to make some order out of this mess. But in the end, many in the Israeli establishment officials do say that he did not make any order, but rather just made it much more messier to try and create a ceasefire and a diplomatic solution for this. Nevertheless, the Israeli cabinet did agree for the humanitarian ceasefire. Israel agreed as long as it would, the ceasefire allows the IDF to continue to target the tunnels and continue operate against the tunnels. Kerry's proposal didn't have that. The humanitarian ceasefire did mean that the IDF can stay at its positions and continue the target. And today, the Security Cabinet will be meeting again to discuss further steps. It's true the diplomacy is still underway, but there is I don't remember such a mess regarding the whole efforts. Like, everyone is involved, and that's one of the problems. Israel and Egypt are not very satisfied with the whole diplomatic outcome of the past few days.
And just to clarify, within the Security Cabinet itself, there wasn't really a unanimous decision this time, as there was in the past.
Well, yesterday evening, there was a very, from we understand from one of the cabinet ministers, it was one of the most difficult meetings that took place ever for this security cabinet. It's true there are 3 cabinet ministers that even didn't agree to the humanitarian ceasefire.
And they publicly acknowledged that as well.
And they publicly acknowledged it, but in the end, the Prime Minister and Defense Minister and other moderate ministers agreed to continue in accepting the ceasefire. This is part of Israel's claim and case to the international community, accepting the humanitarian ceasefire and then having Hamas actually not abide to it. It actually builds Israel's legitimacy to continue the offensive.
Each country is, of course, sovereign to appoint its own foreign minister or secretary of state as it sees fit. And Israel has Avigdor Lieberman as Minister of Foreign Affairs, nothing to greatly admire. But nevertheless, what President Obama has done in appointing U.S. senators, first Hillary Clinton and now John Kerry as Secretary of State, was intended probably to have some sway in Congress. Whether it succeeded in that or not is another matter. But obviously, professional negotiators of the caliber of Henry Kissinger, of James Baker, are lacking now. And because the U.S. Position in the region and in the world is not as paramount as it used to be, this is now salient, and the region is suffering from not having someone shrewd enough to bridge the gap between the parties.
Yossi, the Pentagon also warned against getting rid of Hamas completely. This is a report that we're hearing early this morning from Reuters, saying something else much worse can come in its place. Do you think that was part of the Israeli Security Cabinet's decision for this kind of humanitarian ceasefire?
Well,
and is it something that they're discussing?
First of all, you don't need the Pentagon to warn you that the choices are not between good and better, but between bad and worse. I mean, everyone who is reading the papers and following the events in the Middle East knows that that's the alternative. That there is such a risk that if Hamas is toppled, then even more radical, militant, anti-Israeli, anti-Western group will take over. Well, I think at the outset of the operation, even before the hostilities began, I heard talking to officials, military officials and cabinet ministers, that they know that Hamas should be weakened but not toppled. That was their stated goal, aspiring solution. But I'm afraid that the more the cabinet meetings are convened, we see that they are dealing with tactical issues. They don't deal with the strategic issue. Do they know? Do they have a clear vision what they want to achieve? The stated goal of the ground incursion was to get rid of the tunnels, to discover them, uncover them, and then to demolish them. But now they are talking about different goals, and I'm not sure they have a clear vision what they want to achieve. I mean, we use this cliche of exit. What is their exit strategy? So I would not repeat it, but how do they see the ending of this conflict? And I'm afraid that the cabinet doesn't have a clue. And
could we give the benefit of the doubt, perhaps, to Secretary of State Kerry, saying maybe he understands that there's something worse coming, and thus he's pushing for a ceasefire?
The Israeli cabinet ministers also know it, but I think they are now kind of taken hostage of their own decision-making process and of the public demand for harsher measures to be taken against Hamas. It resembles the first Lebanese war. More and more we are there, more and more we are stuck there with no clear vision how to get out.
We're going to go straight to our I-24 news correspondent, Michal Divon. Michal, you're on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning. We've just heard, of course, that the IDF has resumed attacks on the Gaza Strip. What's the latest from there?
That's right, Yael. The IDF has resumed aerial, naval, and ground activity in the Gaza Strip. We're currently hearing a lot of artillery fire. This is after at least 24 hours of quiet on this front. Now, the end of the humanitarian ceasefire and the resuming of the IDF activity in the Gaza Strip comes as a result of the barrage of rockets which came from Gaza into Israel this morning. Actually, since yesterday at 8 p.m., there was a resuming of the rockets fired into Israel. Just a short while ago, there were barrages to the entire south as well as the center of the country, where we are at the moment at the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council. Only today, there were 10 rockets fired in this area. The residents living here have 15 seconds to run to shelters. We're here very, very close to the border, 2 kilometers away from the northern part of the Gaza Strip. As far as residential activity, most people have been evacuated, as there's always high alert, at least during this past week, for not only rockets but an infiltration. There's noise here on my right because there's a lot of army activity, and behind me, as you can see, there's an army post. Most of these communities near the Gaza border have become army zones this past week.
Michal Divon, our I-24 News correspondent there on the Israeli-Gaza border. Thank you for joining us. Of course, you will be updating us throughout. Tal, looking at Kerry and the Israeli cabinet's, let's say, perception of him as of late, one can say, okay, he's completely clueless as to what's going on, but it doesn't mean he doesn't have Israel's maybe best interest on his agenda. It's just he maybe doesn't understand the situation. It's a way to look at it.
To begin with, he was an unwanted guest. Mm-hmm. He arrived here, not Israel, not Egypt, really wanted the U.S. intervention. The president sent him. He felt, I believe him, it was an authentic sense of urgency to arrive in the region and start mediating. But look at how he was treated. He was, what we spoke about it, he was welcomed by security scanners at the Egyptian presidential palace. Then he was welcomed by a picture of a frown of Netanyahu greeting him. Just 5 seconds photo op, very, very cold and clearly not very warmful greeting. And then on Friday evening, even though Friday evening he learns from the media basically that Israel has rejected his ceasefire proposal, and he has to squibble on air and try to explain what happened. Mm-hmm. It's true. Israel feels, and there's a lot of anger towards Kerry regarding his proposal. Israeli officials have been briefing that the proposal is a Qatari proposal. He adopted the Hamas point of view, and I think in the end, Kerry fell in where he usually fell, where he fell also in the 9-month negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, not clearly understanding what is at stake and not clearly understanding. Israeli officials say that he's totally not on our side, meaning Israel and Egypt. We are his regional allies, and he's just strengthening the Muslim Brotherhood. But nevertheless, if I may add, the situation that the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, learns from the media that that the Israeli cabinet has rejected his ceasefire proposal is unacceptable. There is a lack of communication. There should be a better communication between and much more respect from the Israeli cabinet to the U.S. Secretary of State. It's easy to say that this is my view, it's easy to say that the U.S. has a diminishing role in the Middle East and there's a decline in the role. But if you actively assist that, if you actively act to also undermine their status, this also doesn't help.
Yeah, Amir?
Strategically, as well as domestically, the position of both Israel and Hamas has not changed substantially since the conflict began. Each side is asking, what do I have, what can I show my people in return for my investment? And before the ground operation began, 10 days ago or so, Israel was willing to take its minor losses and go home without destroying the tunnels. Mm-hmm. Now it has invested 43 soldiers killed. Mm-hmm. The cost is definite. It is there. The achievement, the gain, is yet to be seen. So Israel wants to leave Gaza, first of all, after all the tunnels which have been discovered are destroyed, and secondly, with some sort of promise, it could be vague, but some sort of promise that for the foreseeable future, it will not face such a threat. Hamas, on the other hand, wants to see a substantive gain in having some relief, some economic relief for the population of Gaza. The question is the sequence. How can you find a sequence which would satisfy
both sides? It's like a chicken and an egg.
And this is the art of negotiations in which Kerry has failed.
Because a senior minister, now this is a question for all of you, said this morning on Israeli radio that yesterday, Saturday, when there was a humanitarian ceasefire or humanitarian timeout, Israeli forces were able to combat the tunnel threat double the time or multiply it by at least ×3 the way they were able to do it when they were under fire. Is that feasible enough for the Israeli Defense Forces to say, okay, maybe we shouldn't maybe we should go for a ceasefire just so that we can combat the threat of the tunnels?
But the Israeli Defense Forces love this ceasefire as long as it is not called a ceasefire, because work is going on even during the Sabbath, and out of the 31...
Yeah, but that was part of also the deal, that the IDF would be able to continue.
What the IDF wants to do is prepare the tunnels for a complete demolition, not do a shoddy job of just partly destroying the tunnels. The more time it has on its hands, we are going to see a huge explosion once it leaves Gaza of 24 tunnels or more going up in the air. This is going to be Israel's victory picture. And for the Israelis, headed by Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, the work is basically over. Nobody really wants to go ever deeper into Gaza. It is going to take weeks, if not months, and occupying Gaza is going to take a year or two. So the operation is basically over as far as conquering more land was intended. And now they are mopping up and just preparing the tunnels for demolition.
But Yossi, we're also hearing reports that Egypt has also started targeting these tunnels as well, meaning the quote-unquote surprise of these tunnels for the IDF forces is being combated also by our neighbor to the south.
Well, they have been doing it for the last year. They destroyed most of the tunnels connecting between Gaza and Sinai.
Right.
They use even a better method than just destroying and using explosives. They flood them with the sewer water, and I still don't understand why Israel is not doing it. It's an option.
To flood them?
Sure.
It's not really an option because what it does to the water used by the settlements nearby. If it could have been done without...
Some of the tunnels can be flooded with water.
Not between Israel and Gaza. Between Gaza and Rafah,
sure,
yes,
in Gaza,
that's
yeah.
true.
But that's not the question. Egypt is doing it, has been doing it, and they cooperate. I am a bit worried. On one hand, it's one should praise the cooperation between Israel and Egypt, which is almost unprecedented, security, intelligence-wise. But on the other hand, these intimate cooperation, collaboration, relations could turn into obstacle to achieve a substantial, significant settlement, long-term settlement. There is a growing concern among some Israelis that actually we are subcontractors for the Egyptian regime and for the Egyptian army, because they want Hamas regime to be removed, to be toppled. Israel doesn't want it, not because we don't want it but because it's not a realistic goal. And therefore, as Amir said, more or less, militarily speaking, the operation has been exhausted, more or less. I mean, you can hit more targets, you can destroy more rockets, but still, the big targets have been achieved. The big goals.
Meaning residents.
Uncovering the tunnels, destroying half of the rocket arsenal of Hamas, and then we need to find a way to square it around in the chicken and egg question, how we come into terms with and find a long-term solution with Hamas. I don't think the problem at the moment is lacking an honest broker. I don't understand the Israeli criticism directed at John Kerry. After all, he came here to save lives. Right. So why should he be criticized? Maybe he's not the most skillful diplomat, although he is in a way. He knows his elements. But you read and hear the Israeli cabinet ministers about negotiations, about honest broker, and you wonder who they want to be the honest broker. Maybe they want Avigdor Lieberman to broker between Israel and Hamas.
We're going to go, we'll get right back to the diplomatic standpoint of this discussion. First, I do want to see a short report summarizing the tunnel activity during the weekend. Let's take a look.
Terror tunnels are the most recent thing to grab the headlines in the Israeli-Hamas fighting on both sides of the Gaza border. The Israeli military says it has discovered 30 tunnels and destroyed 6 so far. Some of those cement-fortified burrows reached into Israel, and since the offensive began, Palestinian gunmen have tried to cross into Israel at least 4 times. Moira and Gil Dro, whose children and grandchildren have moved north since rockets started being aimed at their community, say they now fear more of what is underground than what they can see in the air.
The biggest worry about the tunnels is it's like the unknown. It's not something you can see from above. The army can't see it. Our special forces can't see it. It's something that's a surprise.
The IDF's activity near the border prevented what many locals believe could have turned into many deadly attacks. Although so far Israeli soldiers succeeded in blocking terrorists emerging from tunnels, there is no certainty the success will last, if the ceasefire will end soon.
Tal, it's exactly those, of course, footage that is released to the Israeli public that makes the Israeli public say we can't leave until tunnels are finished. And of course, as Yossi says, and Amir, maybe militarily most of it, the majority has been finished. But will residents be able to go back to the Gaza communities, to the communities surrounding the Gaza Strip, and feel safe? And is that something that's putting pressure on the leadership?
Well, it's definitely putting pressure. It's not only the Gaza, right. Gaza envelope residents. It's the whole Israeli public. When you speak to an average Israeli on the street, they have created this threat, the tunnel threat. It's a demonizing threat. It's it's a catastrophic threat. There was a report about the terror attack that was planned on the New Year's Eve. 200 terrorists trying to infiltrate 6 points in Israel. That's something that really created terror. It did succeed to create a sense of fear in the Israeli public. And when you have ministers in the Israeli cabinet speaking on the record saying we have to continue, this, of course, affects the public. Even if they hear the military analysts saying that the IDF operation has almost exhausted themselves, that doesn't speak to the average Israeli. They want to have their sense of security back, and that is something that Netanyahu definitely has to take into consideration. Netanyahu has to end this operation with something he can present to his public. And at this moment, if he leaves, politically, it will be very difficult for him to convince the Israeli public that the threat has been thwarted. If he does succeed to get a long-term solution with some kind of disarmament clause regarding Gaza, again, it's not it's not a real solution. It's not a realistic solution. Many are skeptic that it's something that can even be implemented. But at least for the statement, if Netanyahu can present some achievement on that front, that could help him. But at the moment, if he leaves, if he stops now, he will definitely be paying a price, especially when his own ministers are bypassing him from the right, saying that the IDF should continue the operation and expand it.
Amir, hold your thought. I'm going to get right to you. I just want to get an update now from Nick Casey, the Wall Street Journal reporter in the Gaza Strip, and you've been there, of course, since the beginning of Operation Protective Edge. Can you give us the latest from where you are right now? Of course, the humanitarian ceasefire that was brokered or agreed upon yesterday was of course ended early last night as well, and of course early this morning. Now we're hearing reports that the IDF has begun its attacking back into the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm in the hotel. I don't think anybody is going out again today because it's clear that the rockets have started again from Hamas, and it won't be too long until the Israelis start to fire again into Gaza City. I also think everybody got a good chance to see everything they needed to see and stock up yesterday, and it was really ugly here. I think it was the first time that many Palestinians and most of the reporters actually got to look at just what damage had been caused by the Israeli attacks here. I mean, we saw entire neighborhoods where there was very little left, all the buildings destroyed. animals that were dead on the ground, minarets of mosques that had been blown out, and lots of people being pulled out of the rubble. Almost 150 people's bodies were recovered. So many people that there weren't actually room in the graveyards for them. There were people that were being buried in the graves of other relatives that had been dug already on top of their bodies.
And when you did walk around the Gaza Strip yesterday during the humanitarian ceasefire, what was the sentiment among the population? Were they stocking up, as you say, on food and supplies and waiting for a longer ceasefire, which Israel did decide to extend by 24 hours? Or were they, of course, still backing the Hamas leadership?
I think at this point, what the average Gazan has seen from Israel only has taken the form of airstrikes and blockades. So it's very difficult to imagine an average Gazan, especially this week, supporting anyone else other than someone local here. And for a lot of people, that's Hamas, although there are a lot of people who are angered at Hamas for continuing to fight. They want both sides to put their arms down. The thing that's been surprising to me as a reporter here is just the amount of calm that people have had, given the complete destruction that has been happening to many neighborhoods here, despite the fact that many people have lost children, have seen the intestines of their sons and daughters on the road, have not been able to save them. Many people have been able to pick up, try to survive, not freak out, not panic. And I saw a lot of that during the ceasefire. People were very calm. People were not extremely aggressive, and we're just trying to get from one day to the next until this finishes.
And what would you attribute that to? I know you can make now a study or so forth, but why would you say that the Gazans are, despite, of course, the horrors and tragedies that they're seeing, they're still looking towards Hamas as a leadership? Is it because there's a lack of another leadership, as the Pentagon has even warned to?
I think there aren't many choices here. For no matter what Hamas's tactics have been, and the tactics aren't the tactics of a government. It's not a democracy here, but this is a place that Gazans are looking out, and they don't see anybody who is defending them besides the Hamas fighters, which I think is even more of an argument to have more of a political system here where there could be many different options in Gaza.
Nick Casey, of course, the Wall Street Journal reporter there in the Gaza Strip. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we will, of course, continue to get updates from you, hopefully. And thank you for joining us again. We're going to go to a short break now, and we'll continue after the short break with more from the special edition of I-24 News Morning Edition. Of course, special broadcast this morning, day 20 of Operation Protective Edge. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us here at I-24 News Morning Edition. Of course, this is a special broadcast this morning, day 20 of Operation Protective Edge. Still with me in studio is I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev. Tal, thank you for staying with us. Senior defense correspondent from Haaretz, Amir Oren, thank you. And the security intelligence expert, Yossi Melman, thank you. Of course, the death toll on the Israeli side has reached 43. This morning, the IDF announced that Sergeant First Class Barak Rafael de Gorker, 27 years old, from Gan Yavne, succumbed to his wounds that he sustained from mortar fire on the Gaza border last night. On Saturday night, the Army announced that 2 soldiers injured in fighting over the past week had died of their wounds. Captain Liad Lavi, 22, an infantry corps officer from Tel Yosef, was wounded in fighting, and Sergeant Major Rami Kachlon, 39 years old, an infantry non-commissioned officer from Hadera, who was injured on July 22nd and died from his wounds. We're coming back here now. We're going to go soon to our correspondent there in Soroka Hospital to get, of course, another update of the wounded. Amir, the wounded keep on piling up. The cost, as you said, is known. Is there a red line in terms of, when you compare it to other military offenses, does the Israeli army and the military establishment put a red line in terms of the cost? And I'm talking about the deaths, of course.
When operations begin to fail, And of course, every expert and even every soldier would have his own perspective on it. But when Israeli Defense Forces operations begin to fail, casualties start to mount. And you had the Karame operations in Jordan in 1968 with some 30 Israelis killed. Then you had the Litani operation in Lebanon. 10 years later, again, some 30 Israelis killed. 43 Israelis killed for gaining just a couple of kilometers and destroying the tunnels, which up to 2 weeks ago were a known phenomena, but were never depicted as such a threat. This is not something the Israeli public is going to swallow without having a very big achievement to show for it. So the cabinet is understandably divided between those who wish to go even deeper and those cooler heads which know that casualties are going to mount some more. Before, Yossi Melman earlier mentioned the first war in Lebanon in 1982. When Prime Minister Begin was shown the plans by Defense Minister Sharon and Chief of Staff Eitan, he was told that it will take between 48 and 72 hours and that no more than several dozens of casualties are expected. We ended up with hundreds of casualties, many of them from so-called friendly fire. So military veterans in the cabinet and in the IDF High Command know that it is only an illusion, that if you go deeper, you'll get more gains without paying a heavier price.
We're going to get a quick update now from Ron Friedman, our I-24 news correspondent there in Soroka Hospital in Beersheba. Ron, what's the latest?
Hi, good morning. So Soroka in the city of Beersheba is enjoying a rare lull in rocket fire, but here at the hospital behind me, one of the major and most advanced hospitals in Israel, things are never quiet. We have medical staff standing by 24 hours a day to receive wounded from the Gaza conflict. The most recent action here was overnight when Sergeant First Class Barak Dogerker passed away here. He was brought in critical condition after being wounded by shrapnel from a mortar where he was stationed. He and his fellow reservists were standing at a staging area just outside the Gaza Strip when the mortar shell fell and exploded. He suffered critical injuries, was brought here to Soroka, and died when he arrived here. In general, doctors here are taking care of roughly 38 patients at the moment from the Gaza conflict. 3 of them are in critical or in serious condition, the rest suffering light and moderate injuries. It doesn't stop for a moment. In the hospital here also takes civilian cases. Things here are what they are. It's a war zone, or it's near a war zone, and things here are tense.
Definitely tense and tough, and thank you, of course, for joining us from Soroka in Beersheba. Yossi, I want to take off where Amir left off. Obviously, the costs are known, and we can compare it to other wars. But if I can mix it with what Tal Shalev said earlier, the public opinion is also putting pressure on the security cabinet to decide certain things. Strictly militarily speaking, is there any kind of benefit to stay more and extend this operation in terms of the tunnels?
No, you can only lose. It's a lose-lose situation. It's not a win-win situation. The more you stay, the more casualties you sustain, fatalities, wounded soldiers. It's going to be more and more complicated. Things can get from bad to worse. And we saw it from other operations. I mean, all Israeli major, I would not call them wars, but operations began with a big hooray. The public was behind it, including the first Lebanese war in 1982. Very few in the parliament voted against it. There is a national consensus. People rally around the leadership. And then the more time passes, more and more people have their doubts whether it was worth. I tend to believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu knows it very well. He can only lose from continued operation. But on the other hand, maybe he's trapped by his own cabinet, his own party, and the general public. Now, the public, I think, in this operation is supporting the government, is behind the government. Right. Even maybe is more radical, the cabinet. There is a feeling in the public that, in the Israeli public, that they want to defeat Hamas because we have suffered so much. But the public mood can easily overnight change. It's very slippery. If we suffer more casualties and maybe a big disaster, horrifying event which would lead to the death of many Israeli soldiers, then the public mood will change overnight. So, look, in the Second Lebanese War, in 2006, 121 Israeli soldiers were killed. 1/4 of them, I believe, in the last 2 days.
Right. We're going to go, of course, talking about public opinion, divided public opinion. Nearly 3,000 people gathered at Tel Aviv's Rabin Square last night to protest, of course, against the military offensive in Gaza, while another part of the city square, counter-protest, was organized by right-wing demonstrators. There was a large police presence at the rally, included mounted police who were separating, of course, between the two sides. Police arrested 5 right-wing counter-protesters. But when the rocket attacks from Gaza resumed, as sirens were heard in southern and central Israel, the police ordered the crowds end their protests because of the renewed rocket barrages. With me now on the phone is former Meretz member of Knesset, Mossi Raz. Mossi, thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Can you give us a feeling of the sentiment among the 3,000 protesters that did show up, despite, of course, warnings of any kind of rocket barrages that would come, and, of course, threats from the right wing to disrupt this protest?
Yes, first, I think there were more than 3,000, but this is not that important. I think what you have said is exactly what we felt. I know many people who wanted to come yesterday night, but were afraid to do that. I know other people who wanted to come, but heard the police order not to come. This is something that we never happened in the democracy of Israel, that the police gave a permit for a demonstration, and then 2 hours before the demonstration said, called the crowd not to come. Anyhow, thousands arrived, way more than what we expected, and we know that many others wanted to come and didn't come. I think it was very important. It was a kind of a light in the end of the tunnel, talking about tunnels. People who called the government to agree to the ceasefire as was proposed by the Americans. I hear that even a member of Knesset from the coalition called yesterday night to the government to accept this offer, and to say that violence against violence just doesn't work. We should use negotiations in order to achieve the goal of stopping the missiles, which are war crime, no question about that.
But mostly, of course, the protesters last night were calling on the government to accept a ceasefire brokered either by the Americans or another ceasefire that will be put on the table. But when Hamas has resumed its firing on Gaza, on communities surrounding the Gaza Strip last night, and of course into central Israel this morning, is it hard to convince the rest of the public that the ceasefire must be put on the table first before, of course, destabilizing Hamas?
Of course it is difficult, but Hamas is violent. Hamas is a terrorist organization. We did not come yesterday night to support Hamas. We came to say we need, as citizens of this state, we need to have security. We need to stop the missiles, and the violence did not stop the missiles. That's why we have to use other means. And the fact that the government did not agree to the proposed ceasefire by the Americans, our best friends, is very frustrating. Now, I think that the government was afraid that the Hamas will accept the ceasefire, and otherwise they cannot understand why they say no. If they think that the Hamas will say no, why should they say no? They should say yes, and then to tell that the Hamas broke the ceasefire.
Right.
Anyhow, unfortunately, we don't have ceasefire at all right now.
Indeed. Former Meretz member of Knesset Mossi Raz, thank you for joining us this morning. I do want to speak now to Mickey Rosenfeld, the spokesperson for the Israeli police. Thank you for joining us. Mickey? We're having a bit of technical difficulties. We will get to Mickey Rosenfeld in just a second. Tal, I want you to respond, of course, to Yossi's question, of course, of public opinion. Within the cabinet, one will say, cynically perhaps, that they're looking at the political campaign after this campaign is over, and thus three ministers that you mentioned earlier have almost systematically denied or any kind of opposed Netanyahu's line of thinking.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Netanyahu is trapped from. I think that Netanyahu is also trapped from the lack of an honest or at least effective broker at the moment. It is true that Kerry came with very, very good intentions and all he wanted to do was save lives. But when you see the newspapers today, in Israel, in the Palestinian Authority, and in Egypt, he succeeded to annoy all of the main actors, actually. Yesterday, convening the international meeting in Paris with no Egyptian or Palestinian representative from the Palestinian Authority is kind of really explains why Netanyahu or Egypt or the Palestinian Authority, there is no effective broker at the moment that can actually...
Who could be an honest broker? According to the Israeli perspective.
I think Kerry could have been an honest broker if he wouldn't arrive.
Vladimir Putin.
China offered, they also...
No, I mean, you have to be realistic. There are no players.
But Kerry arrived and made numerous mistakes. Kerry came, and at some point, if Egypt and the Palestinian Authority and Israel are all furious at Kerry for involving Qatar and for taking Qatar and Turkey's stand, then maybe there was a mistake from Kerry's point of view. And the Americans, and just after the 9-month peace talks broke down.
But Kerry is not accepted by Hamas. Therefore, he needs some levers to Hamas via the Turks or more via
Shimon Peres is now available.
That is true.
I mean, that's the Israeli mistake. We want the best possible broker to clinch a deal which would be in our favor. But if you want a deal, you need to make compromises. You need two for tango.
I'll let you respond. We do have Mickey Rosenfeld now on the line, the Israeli police spokesperson. Mickey, thank you for joining us. Could you give us the police perspective from last night's rally, of course, in the Rabin Square, a rally that could have turned much more violent than it probably did in the end?
Well, what took place yesterday evening is there was a demonstration which was planned and coordinated with the Israeli police. Our different units were on the scene in order to be prepared for that incident. And there were approximately 2,000 people that arrived in the central part of the Tel Aviv area in the Rabin Square. And police units were on the scene in order to prevent both the large number of left-wing demonstrators and separate between the right-wing demonstrators that also turned up there.
And we are hearing of 5 protesters from the right-wing counter-protesters that were arrested. What were they arrested for?
There were 5 people that were arrested at the scene by police units that were at the area in order to prevent scuffles from breaking up. They attempted to block the roads, but the most significant point that took place yesterday evening is that during the demonstration itself, there were sirens that went off in the southern part and central part of Israel.
Right.
And it was necessary for the Israeli police to request from all the demonstrators to leave the area as quick as possible in order to prevent anyone from being injured.
And of course, since then, we've had many more rocket attacks into Israel. How are the police dealing with this? Of course, they're firing into residential areas in the center of the country. How has the police been dealing with this in the past 20 days?
Well, in the southern part of the city, and emphasis on the Sderot, Ashkelon, and Beersheba areas, the Israeli police units are in and around the different areas to respond. We've had rockets that have landed in the different areas. The main message to the public at the moment is that as soon as sirens go off, both in the southern central areas to go into safe zones and safe areas, this is important in order to prevent people from being injured and possibly killed as those rockets are being fired into Israel.
Mickey Rosenfeld, Israel police spokesperson, thank you for joining us this morning. Amir, you want to mention something about the police?
A few weeks ago, we were all involved in the abduction and murder, first of the 3 Israeli youth and then the Palestinian boy, and demonstrations and counter-demonstrations started even then, before the ground operation.
Right.
The Tel Aviv police was surprised by the violent reaction of the right-wing demonstrators to the left-wing demonstrators, only for one and the first demonstration. Later, the police commissioner of the Tel Aviv district, Major General Ben Sisau, has seen fit to invite the leaders of the left-wing demonstrators to his office, promised them protection, urged them to use their right of speech and protest, and indeed offered his protection, and the police has served as a buffer between these two groups, and they should be commended for it. Regarding your second question, what the southern district of the Israeli police has done is also outstanding. And if you see Major General Yoram Alevi of the southern district going around with his officers, while they are not in the headlines because the military is, they are always doing excellent work there too.
And keeping with the public opinion debate, things like this, protests like this that have turned violent, maybe surprisingly so for many of us in the middle of the conflict, is this something that, of course, will stay even after the campaign ends? Or can we look at other campaigns in Israeli history that once there's a quiet on the ground, everyone kind of goes back to their indifferent way of life?
No, unfortunately, it is here to stay because the Israeli society has been polarized. It may have moved to the right. And because of the impact of social media, it is now very easy to get thousands of people to come to a rally. You've seen the pro-right protesters in the segment that you've shown. They look like football fans in a stadium. And the mark of a football fan is that you have a leader who doesn't even watch the game his own team is playing. He is with his back to the game. He is trying to inflame the other fans, and this is what we saw: people with megaphones trying to incite against other peaceful demonstrators. So it is very, very frightening. We had such problems in 1983, right after Sharon was ousted by the Kahan Commission, and we had the Emil Grunzweig murder. Let's hope that it doesn't come back to haunt us, but it is very, very sensitive, and the police must be very careful to watch over it.
But Tal, it's not only social media and so forth, or the polarization of Israeli society. There are political elements, perhaps in Jerusalem, that are also pushing for this polarization, maybe not intentionally, of course, but there are some figures in Knesset that are maybe the leaders of these streams.
There are some very loud and very provocative and very, let's say, not enough educated Knesset members and ministers that have been calling, that have been assisting and contributing to this polarization. One of the problems is that the Israeli society as a whole has, in the past few years, it's a process, isn't able to hear any criticism, and you can, if it comes from the outside or it comes from the inside, and every word of criticism is immediately denounced as traitoring. And you hear today, this week, the finance minister Yair Lapid, who himself is a center politician, writes in one of the newspapers, basically calls to boycott the Haaretz newspaper, basically calls to denounce freedom of expression, one of the best, if not the best newspapers in Israel in history. And this is something that definitely there's a closing on the variety of ideas that someone can voice inside the Israeli society is getting narrower and narrower, and the politicians definitely have a contribution to that.
There are echoes of the McCarthy era here, of the enemy within, of guilt by association, equating so-called leftists with the adversary, and it may end violently. It is a very, very tense period, and if there is no leadership not from behind but from above, if cooler heads do not prevail, we are in for a very sorry time.
I think it will also end in a wave of immigration from Israel. In the end, this generation that is there is a large generation.
But who will take us?
everyone is looking for a European citizenship. So many in Israel feel that this atmosphere is an atmosphere that is deteriorating, and that they're looking for other places. You can see it already. You can see it in the academy,
right,
that people in philosophy and humanities are looking for other places to be, because in Israel there is a growing sense of isolating and only closing the openness of ideas.
Yossi, do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. There is a process of paranoia taking place in Israeli society. Already the Israeli left or left of center has been marginalized. We see it from the election results, one after another. The Israeli left is not left and center is not capable of forming a government, because the voters are not voting for such a government. And then right-wing politicians, you asked whether maybe it's unintentional. It is intentional. Politicians are inciting.
But even politicians such as Finance Minister Yair Lapid, who voted, his voters obviously are not...
Because he is dragged into it. There is a bad waves are sweeping all over the countries. And I think it's one of the first wars in which I have covered, that politicians in the middle of the war are exploiting the battlefields to rally voters for their political campaigns. I didn't see it in previous wars. In previous wars, there was a core sense of national consensus, at least as long as people are killed in the battlefields. This time, from the outset, already politicians, right-wing politicians, started to exploit the situation, and it's a vicious circle, because if Benjamin Netanyahu, as a prime minister, feels that he's outflanked by Naftali Bennett, therefore, he has to respond, adjust and respond.
But there is a dissonance, because Netanyahu has been pushed to the center. As of now, this outflanking move pushed Netanyahu to the center, so he is backed, at least in public opinion polls, by more people than ever. However, in the right wing, which is his base, his constituency, he is in the minority.
Right.
And he may lose the leadership of the Likud, and his claim for the prime ministership to Gideon Sa'ar or to Avigdor Lieberman or to Naftali Bennett, and he is in for a fight within his own party.
And you're hearing more and more predictions that the minute the operation is over, then the countdown for the next elections begin, and that is where Netanyahu could be paying a price inside his own constituency.
If I may add one more sentence, the media, the cabinet, and the public are dealing with tactical issues. And we need a leader who would see from a bird's eye position the entire picture.
Maybe you, Yossi. You're available.
But what about the former security establishment leaders, people such as Yuval Diskin and so forth, who have been critical of the government since even before the operation for a while now? Are they do they have any impact on the public? Or in the times of war, we're all for the government, and thus even people like Yuval Diskin don't have a voice?
Some of the anti-Netanyahu forces, such as the Yediot Ahronot paper, are trying to bolster Yuval Diskin now. They tried it with Ehud Olmert earlier.
But his credibility does have, without getting cynical about who's bolstering who, his credibility in the Israeli public is something.
Yuval Diskin? Well, Yuval Diskin is a non-entity politically yet, and former security chiefs are somewhat suspect, because while in office they are always perceived as rightist and hawks, and right after retiring it turns out that they were always doves. So people are cynical regarding them. He must join a party or form a party of his own. The experience of such center parties led by former security or military types like Yitzhak Mordechai or Amnon Lipkin-Shahak is not very good. If he gravitates towards the Labour Party, which he hasn't shown any indication of, he will find Yitzhak Herzog, the current leader, waiting for him, willing to give him the security portfolio, but not willing to relinquish the leadership position. So no one is on the horizon yet. no one has appeared, which is why Likud, led by Netanyahu, still has the upper hand. And the current chief of staff, Benny Gantz, if he does come out of this conflict
victorious.
Yes, with his colors flying, which is not yet certain, still has 3 years following his retirement next February to wait for being eligible for politics. So we'll have to wait and see.
I also think that the Israeli public for the past 5 weeks has been hearing so many ex-security officials on TV. If it's Diskin or it's Yadlin or it's everyone is on TV. Nobody really knows who is who, who's where. The Israeli public is hearing 24 hours for 5 weeks, almost 20 or 18 hours a day news, and people giving their commentary if they're security establishment or non-security establishment. I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of nobody really knows what's the political, what's the security, and what are the motives behind most of the things that people are saying.
One ex-general who may try to throw his hat in the ring is Yoav Gallant, who wanted to be chief of staff.
Right.
He may still wish to come back into uniform, hasn't lost his dream, but if not, he looks as if he wants to join the political echelon because he always says on television, I know how to deal with it, I have the solutions, so he may want to share it with the public.
Okay, we're going to keep it there. We're going to have to go to a news break from the I-24 News Desk. I want to thank all my panelists this morning. We'll be back after the quick news break from the I-24 News Desk with more from the special edition of the I-24 News Morning Edition. We're going to leave you with pictures, of course, from the Gaza Strip this morning. The IDF has resumed its attacks, live pictures now from the Gaza Strip, after it said Hamas, of course, disobeyed the humanitarian ceasefire that was put into place and voted upon within the Israeli Security Cabinet. As we said, the IDF has resumed attacks now in the Gaza Strip. We'll be back. Welcome back to I-24 News Morning Edition. Of course, we're in a special broadcast this morning. It's the 20th day of Operation Protective Edge. A humanitarian truce was unilaterally ended by Hamas last night when it resumed rocket fire, although Israel had agreed to hold its fire for another 24 hours. Less than an hour ago, the IDF did announce that it will be resuming its fire on the Gaza Strip, due, of course, to Hamas's rejection of the ceasefire. This morning, the latest barrage, which took place in the early morning hours, sirens sounded in the Sharon and Shfela regions, in Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gan Yavne, and towns and villages on the Gaza periphery. A Hamas spokesman responded to the Israeli extension by saying that any ceasefire that doesn't ensure that the IDF pulls out of Gaza and the evacuation of the injured is not acceptable. An Israeli Defense Forces soldier was killed early this morning by a mortar shell near the Gaza border, and 2 other Israeli soldiers died who were previously injured in fighting, died of their wounds last night. The latest deaths bring the IDF death toll to 43. With the Gaza death toll said to reach over 1,000, Israeli military sources are noting that several hundred Hamas gunmen are among those that have been killed. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has headed back to Washington after Israel rejected its ceasefire proposal, and diplomatic efforts have been put not really much on the table. With me and now in studio is I-24 News senior Middle East correspondent and editor Ali Waked. Thank you for joining us. The former chairman of the Yesha Council, Dani Dayan, thank you for joining us. And the head of the Diplomacy and Conflict Studies Department at the IDC, Professor Galia Golan. Thank you for joining us. Ali, I do want to start with you. Hamas has rejected, of course, any of the ceasefire that was put on the table yesterday. There was a relative calm for a couple of hours, and the rockets continued last night.
Yeah, because Hamas made it very clear that any arrangement that will not include the lifting of the blockade over the Gaza Strip, it won't accept it. And we should pay attention, Yael, that Qatar and Turkey were part of the international declaration that called for a humanitarian ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire that the international community want to see continuing, and Hamas rejected it. Hamas understand that the population saw yesterday the damages and the destructions, and it need to deliver something new to the population, that this round was worth to go into, and without any talk about an Israeli accept to go for a lifting of the blockade, partial or fully lifting, Hamas cannot accept any ceasefire. So we are in a situation that, on one hand, the population that is very tired of this round of confrontation will tolerate more days of fire exchange, because this part of Hamas conditions was not accepted. On the other hand, the Egyptians still believe that Israel didn't give this big hit to Hamas, and they want to see Hamas more weakened before going seriously into the picture of the arrangement.
And of course, we look on the Israeli side as well, who have also rejected the Kerry proposal. Professor Golan, when you see the sides here at stake, it seems, and I heard a senior minister saying this morning to Israeli radio, that the people involved, Israel, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority, are actually not those negotiating. It's the Americans, the Qataris, and the Turks, and thus there's not really any kind of honest broker.
I don't know if there's an honest broker or not. I suspect that Kerry is an honest broker. But I think we've got both sides disinterested in a ceasefire. I think for the reasons we just heard, Hamas has from the very beginning had, I think, basically wanted to put off an end until it could either see or both see Israel being blamed for over 1,000 deaths, and also have something to show for all of this. That is, that Hamas would have something to show politically for all of this. And Israel at this point, I think, wants to continue to destroy the tunnels. It has a lot more it plans to do, apparently. So it's not interested, and certainly not interested in the conditions, as far as I know, the conditions of the Kerry proposal. Neither side wants them. That is to say, they include, apparently, some kind of shift or change in the siege on Gaza, which Israel doesn't agree to. Israel wants no conditions, a ceasefire in place, and then talk. Whereas Hamas doesn't want a ceasefire in place where Israel might continue working against the tunnels and needs to have something to show. So we're in a situation, I think, where neither side is really all that anxious for a ceasefire. That's what we've seen. They've both rejected it. And, of course, the people suffering are the soldiers on our side and the Gazans on the other side.
And this is amazing, Tal, to see that the public opinion in Israel and most of the ministers, who at least speak to the media, go against this ceasefire. But during the humanitarian ceasefire, the IDF did not stop for a single minute its operations against the tunnels. And this is one of the main reasons that Hamas was against this humanitarian ceasefire, because it gives the IDF the right to continue operating against the tunnels. It is
although
true.
Not one shot was fired. It's dismantling the tunnels.
Absolutely, absolutely. But for Hamas, the shooting and the tunnels are at the same level of importance. Hamas infrastructure is mainly based on the tunnels, and the IDF continuing acting against the tunnels is continuing to threat Hamas capacities.
Danny?
Well, I think that the question is not whether we have or we don't have an honest broker. The problem is we have an incompetent broker. Secretary Kerry and the international community that is backing him, but because we have to remember that yesterday in Paris also European Union foreign ministers were present. It seems like the Secretary Kerry and the international community is making every effort to drag Israel into the central square of Gaza City. I mean, they are doing everything possible in their hands in order to hinder the possibility of the ceasefire. The parameters were crystal clear. I mean, Israel cannot for 1 minute accept the moment the right of Israel to keep exposing and destroying tunnels was dropped from the ceasefire offer. The talks for a ceasefire were doomed.
Right.
And that was so obvious that you have to ask yourself, how can be the American diplomacy these days so incompetent, is so blind to the most clear facts on the ground? The second thing that is amazing is the fact that barely a few days after President Erdogan made anti-Semitic declarations comparing Israel, an ally of the United States of America, with Hitler, the Secretary of State of the United States makes every effort to court and to flirt with his foreign affairs minister, with the country. I think it shows the kind of blindness by the American diplomacy that I must say it's really frightening. And not only on an Israeli perspective, in a global perspective.
Meaning, is it the incompetency of this administration, or does it show any kind of strains between the Israeli-U.S. relations that are now reflected in the efforts of the diplomatic efforts?
It's not a question of Israeli interests, it's a question of American interests. I mean, it shows that the American diplomacy, its highest representative, does not understand the reality in the Middle East, does not begin to understand it. I would say even more, if he understands it and nevertheless acts this way, that it's even much more bothering.
Professor Golan, some will say that Kerry's intentions may be good, but he doesn't understand what he's doing here. Even a correspondent from Haaretz newspaper this morning wrote it was like he's an alien landing, in a foreign country and doesn't really know who's who and how to deal with all the sides.
I'm not sure if that's true or not. I find it hard to believe that that would be true, especially since he spent a lot of time on this conflict. But what he has to face, and what we all have to face, are warring sides within the Middle East, obviously. Different interests, and they're very, very complicated. Where does Iran stand in all of this? Sometimes with Egypt, sometimes not with Egypt. It's a very confusing picture. But I think just interpretation of what Kerry's been trying to do in terms of American interests is to acknowledge that throughout the Arab world today, and a lot of places beyond the Arab world, there is a certain degree of legitimacy to the demand by Hamas for some kind of lifting of the siege on Gaza. I think that from that point of view, Kerry came around to seeing that in America's interests, this can't be ignored. Certainly the pictures that are coming out of Gaza has made that point very clear. So I think he's trying to find a combination that it's not just a question of pleasing Qatar or something of that nature, or Saudi Arabia or Egypt, but rather trying to come up with something that is going to respond to American interests and the demands of the public in many places, because this conflict has reached the point, I think, of almost teku, almost a tie. Right. Whereas there was a great deal of sympathy for Israel before, I think gradually now, even the New York Times editorial, which condemns Hamas and so forth, has come out and said the time has come. The time has come.
Threat that has...
I must add that if Secretary Kerry would have conducted the talks with a different approach, he could have brought Israel on board in favor of easing the blockade, provided there is a disarmament, provided the tunnels are destroyed. I mean, the fact that the blockade of Gaza, the so-called blockade of Gaza, in principle, is not an Israeli interest. It's an Israeli necessity right now because of the massive armament by missiles and rockets and who knows what by the Gazans. But the moment this thing is solved, if Kerry would have made this trade-off between disarmament and lifting the blockade, that could have been a win-win situation. Instead, he converted it into a lose-lose situation.
If I may say, I think what's happened is that in a way, it's beginning to become clear, I think, outside, that while we don't like Hamas, there is something very basic here. And we don't call it the occupation, but there is a conflict, a basic conflict. And that's where I think it comes in, is that there isn't a willingness to accept Israel's claim that it's too dangerous for us to allow or to lift the siege, because the siege is now being understood as part of the conflict. And that's, I think, what we've been saying all along, is what we've got here. Of course, we've got a war here, but we've got to look at what brought it about, what's underlying here. and what the results are going to be ultimately. Certainly, we'd like to see a demilitarized Gaza.
Right.
But this isn't going to make any difference, and I doubt that it's even going to happen unless we address the deeper question.
Yeah.
But what has changed, and I want to present that question to you, what has changed this time around, perhaps, is this threat of tunnels that now has also put on Israeli society, public opinion, backing this operation almost unanimously. And I want to, yes, Ali.
Yeah, two notes. Professor Golan talked about the confusion, and I think this is not the only confusion. The fact that the mediators are players now, the Egyptians who want to see the Hamas weakened and even disappearing from the Palestinian scene, they hope that Israel will do the job in trying to eradicate and eliminate Hamas from the Gaza Strip. So the Egyptian mediator is giving the Israeli army more time to deal with Hamas infrastructure. On the other hand, the other mediators, who is the Qatari and the Turks, are more adopting Hamas position. This is why we don't have a clear mediation like we had in the past. This is one thing. The second thing, that the Egyptians are going into an inter-Palestinian conflict. They don't believe that President Abbas is the one that can deliver stability, even when Hamas is out of the game. The Egyptians believe that there should be another Palestinians responsible for the security arrangement. They are mentioning the name, for example, of Mohammed Dahlan, who is the biggest rival of Mr. Abbas inside the Palestinian Authority and inside the Fatah movement. This is why the cards are totally meld this time. Nobody know who is with who and who is against who. And in the middle, the Palestinian population, who also is in a dilemma. The Palestinian population, who is well aware that it is paying the price of Hamas politics, and not Hamas politics only vis-a-vis Israel, but the fact that Hamas took the side of the Muslim Brotherhood against the military system in establishment in Egypt, and now they are paying the price. Plus the fact that the Gazans were paid by the Iranian $200 million a year, and Iran, because of Hamas position in Syria, are now not capable to pay 40,000 employees and civil servants and security men in the Gaza Strip. And now we are seeing that Hamas, 3 days ago, Hassan Nasrallah talked with Khalid Mash'al, and one of the items that were discussed is renewing the context and putting aside what was in the near past, which is Hamas against Hezbollah in the Syrian conflict. And on the other hand, Turkey, who hope that Hamas will be part of the political future arrangement in the region. This is why, with all this card so unclear, what is clear is that we are in front of more days of violence. That at the end of this violence, I'm afraid that the situation will be almost the same.
We're gonna. I want to let all of you respond, but I do want to get the global perspective. And of course, this is another factor that is, of course, influencing the conflict on the ground. That's, of course, the international media. With me, I-24 news correspondent in London, Jonathan Sacherdati. Jonathan, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good to be with you.
Of course, the Israeli leadership and Hamas leadership are also looking at the international community and also at the international media. What trend has been adopted by the international media? What's on the Sunday Times this morning?
Well, the front page of the Sunday Times this morning carries a startling headline for most people in Britain. It says, "Anti-Semitic attacks scar British cities." And it goes on to detail some of the many anti-Semitic attacks taking place now in Britain, which include all sorts of hideous attacks that people weren't expecting ever to re-emerge in Europe. Those range from simply banners in these regular anti-Israel protests going on in the United Kingdom at the moment, saying things like Hitler was right and Hamas, Jews to the gas, are chants regularly heard in these sorts of events. And along with those sorts of things, the most serious incidents listed by the Sunday Times include a BBC journalist who's been reprimanded after appearing to suggest that Western politicians had failed to intervene in the Middle East crisis because they had been bought by the Jews. A rabbi who was attacked by 4 youths outside a Jewish school in Gateshead, bricks being thrown through the window of Northern Ireland's only synagogue on 2 consecutive nights, a group of Asian men who drove through a Jewish area of Greater Manchester, leaning out of their windows, shouting Heil Hitler and hurling missiles at pedestrians, a man on Twitter who called for a Jewish neighborhood in London to be bombed so that Jews could, quote, feel the pain of the Palestinians, and on and on and on. In fact, police say that the reports of anti-Semitic attacks have increased enormously during this operation. And what most fear is that these sorts of hideous banners, chants, and signs, as well as the actual attacks, is not something new at all, and not really something related to Israel, but simply that the current news has given people carte blanche to say these things out on the streets that have always been there, and now nobody is really doing very much about it.
And Jonathan, when you compare London to Paris, which Paris has seen maybe overwhelmingly much more even violent protests compared to London, do you believe that London is now, quote unquote, catching up to the intensity of the protests that we've seen in Paris? And we saw pictures from Paris over the weekend of swastikas and so forth on monuments.
Indeed, and you know what's happening in Paris with the swastikas on the monuments and with much more violent attacks on the synagogue there, even than those happening in the United Kingdom, is something which is terrifying to Jews in the United Kingdom. It's no exaggeration to say that people in Britain are looking across the channel and wondering when this will spread to Britain. And in fact, what is going on in Britain at the moment is not so far removed. Some of the violence may be less declared and less obvious, but the fact remains that even in Paris, when the foreign ministers of the world were there discussing this swastika is painted onto monuments, and the attacks on the synagogues in the last couple of weeks have shown that Jews are not only not particularly safe, but that the authorities are either unable or unwilling to protect them. In Paris, they banned one of the pro-Palestinian marches after the violence that erupted the week before, and yet, when it took place, very little seems to have happened in order to stop it and to protect the Jewish community there.
And we've spoken throughout this operation about the British leadership and its reaction to the operation, both, of course, on the diplomatic level, but now with this headline in the Sunday Times, do you believe you will be hearing different rhetoric from Parliament in Westminster?
For once, this issue seems to be coming out into the open. The front page of the Sunday Times yesterday on Sky News, a debate about this very issue of rising anti-Semitism, and perhaps an increasing awareness that this isn't really about Israel at all. Israel is the hook on which these people are hanging their anti-Semitic cloak. They've always had these feelings inside. There has been a rising anti-Semitism that Jews in the country have always put up with, say Jewish leaders who I've spoken to. And now they feel that at least this is being discussed. But once again, the fear is that even with the strong support from Westminster, from David Cameron, from Philip Hammond and others for the Israeli actions in Gaza at the moment, even with that strong support, it seems that the government is willing to treat this rise in anti-Semitism as something which is shocking and terrible, but which they feel is a byproduct of what is happening in Israel. And many Jews worry that they won't be taking it seriously enough as a consequence, that really there's something rotten at the core which needs dealing with, and that Israel isn't the issue here. The anti-Semitic attacks are quite separate from Israel. And whether or not people like or dislike what's going on in Gaza and what Israel is doing in the region, the Jewish community here feels that actually the government ought to be protecting them regardless from any kind of physical, violent attack or threat.
Jonathan Sachadati, our I-24 News correspondent there in London, thank you for that report this morning. Of course, we will be getting updates from you throughout this week. Again, thank you for joining us. I want to thank my panelists. We will be back after the short break, and we'll take up this discussion from this point exactly. We're going to go for a short break, and we'll be right back. Thank you for staying with us here at I-24 News Morning Edition. Of course, we're here on a special broadcast this morning. It is day 20 of Operation Protective Edge. Still with me in studio is I-24 News senior Middle East analyst Ali Waked. Thank you for staying with us. The former chairman of the Yesha Council, Dani Dayan, thank you for staying with us. And the head of the Conflict and Diplomacy Studies at the IDC, Professor Galia Golan, thank you for staying with us. Professor Golan, I want to start with you. We just heard from our correspondent there in London about the rise in anti-Semitic attacks. Of course, he is comparing it to other operations that Israel waged with the Gaza Strip. And there is a clear rise of anti-Semitism. Sometimes it is confused with anti-Zionism, but this time swastikas and so forth, it's a different picture.
It is. Look, there's plenty of anti-Semitism in Europe. There's also anti-Zionism, and there's also anti-Israel, meaning anti-Israel's policies. They're not all three the same thing.
Right.
You can be opposed, as I am, to the policies of the present government without being an anti-Zionist and certainly without being an anti-Semite. There are all three. And in many ways, the anti-Semitic attacks, which are terrible, of course, divert, in many ways, attention from what is going on here. What is going on here is very serious. And as I keep saying, of course, it's not just a question of this particular battle, this particular war. What we have here is, in a way, in many ways, the expected cycle that we've been in for years. And I think the anti-Semitic attacks really take us in a different direction altogether and unfortunately leave us here with this ongoing conflict.
But Ali, of course, Hamas also looks at the international media, international community for pressuring as a factor in its maybe all-encompassing strategy with Israel. They do look for legitimacy from the international street. Are they getting it this time?
The Palestinian street is maybe getting legitimacy, and the demolitions of Hamas, yeah, but not Hamas. And this is the frustration of Hamas. Hamas was sure that in the very beginning of this operation, at least the ground operation, there will be a serious move within the international community, the international diplomacy that will put pressure to reach a ceasefire agreement that will include also some security arrangement that will allow the lifting of the blockade. Right. Now it is not reached because this is why Hamas is suspecting that there is some players, some of them considered as mediators, who are interested in seeing Hamas disappearing from the scene. This is why Hamas is trying to deliver on the ground, talk about its military achievements against Israel. 5 million Israelis in the shelters, 40 and plus Israeli soldiers who are killed. But for the moment, the Palestinians in the Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Arab world, and the international media is doing a distinction between Hamas and the population. When we are talking about lifting a siege, the Hamas is afraid that the credit for the lifting of the siege, if it happens, won't go to Hamas. And unfortunately, the Palestinian people is paying the political calculations of both sides, but mainly for Hamas.
But Danny, also the Israeli leadership is looking at the international street. They're looking for international credit, quote unquote. How much time will they have to complete their operation?
Well, I don't know. It seems that more than we suspected at the beginning. But you know, also Professor Golan and Mr. Wackett talked about the root causes of the conflict. It's absurd to think that this kind of war is began because Hamas didn't have funds enough to pay the civil servants and the military, etc., etc. When you see the reaction in the Israeli public, I think that you understand that the Israeli public opinion has grasped that this is a back-to-basics conflict. It is not about the blockade. It is not about a rocket here or there. It's a back-to-basics conflict in which is clear Hamas takes those risks and takes those casualties and those harms because they have a strategic aim. And strategic aim, as far-fetched as may sound today, is to liberate Palestine, to liberate Ashdod, and to liberate Ashkelon, and to liberate Safed. This is my understanding. This is my take of the very surprising public reaction of the Israeli public opinion. It's mobilization, it's patriotism that is seen these days.
Even though I'm going to ask you to respond to this, even though that the military establishment has said operationally there's not much more we can do. There is a tunnel threat. We've done what we can do, and we're not. And Hamas is perhaps the best alternative or the worst. The best-worst alternative.
I never was in favor of mingling into internal Palestinian politics. I think it will be a strategic mistake by Israel if it tries to enthrone or even to elevate in some way Mahmoud Abbas or Fatah or the PLO in Gaza. I think we did that terrible mistake in Lebanon in 1982 when we tried to
regime change and so forth.
to put the regime change to be the the kingmakers in an Arab entity, and the consequence was catastrophic. I think we should refrain from that. But we do have a vested interest in the disarmament of Gaza.
And
that's
at the
clear.
cost of what we're seeing now, 43
the military
soldiers.
establishment, in some cases in the last years, was prone to see everything in the tactical perception. I'm not sure that the military establishment of Israel has a very high credit in its strategic vision of the conflict. But I think that in some sense, the Israeli public has surpassed the pundits and the experts and see more clearly the nature of this conflict than maybe the decision makers.
Professor Galan, you may agree with Danny Dan on one thing here, and I'm going to speak for you and you can correct me, that we're only really looking at a tactical kind of outcome. Nobody's looking at a strategic outcome. Your strategic outcome is going to be quite different from Danny's.
Yes, actually I do agree with that. And I also agree that with the way in which Danny's described Hamas. It's absolutely true. And I think this has been one of our problems. While we can't determine who the leaders of the Palestinian population is going to be, we have had an interest, I would assume, in strengthening the moderate elements, strengthening those who say, okay, negotiation, okay, two states, who are willing to reach some kind of an agreement. Hamas has not. And we're in a situation where this continued failure to reach an agreement, to be very frank, to give up territories, rather than make a peace agreement, have brought extremists on both sides to the fore. We have extremists in our own government at the moment, and we've got Hamas out there doing everything it can. I don't think there are very many people who are going to say that Hamas is a good partner, is a partner for peace. I think we did have a chance when Hamas was weak politically and went into a unity government on Fatah's terms, and Fatah's terms were negotiation, nonviolence. But we weren't willing to do that, and we have basically tried to thwart any nonviolent step that's been taken by Abu Mazen. I think that ultimately the real problem in all of this, or what is going to come out of it, is that Hamas will have been strengthened politically in the eyes of the Palestinian public, despite the fact that they're certainly not themselves Islamists, they're not themselves extremists. But Abu Mazen has been so badly discredited. I mean, we can see this in the demonstrations that are taking place in the West Bank.
Right.
They not only, and many of those demonstrating are Fatah people. The leadership has been tremendously discredited because it got nowhere
But from the Israeli side, they see what Fatah is calling for a day of rage and so forth, and they say, how can we, speak to a government that supports what Hamas is doing right now against us?
But the problem here is that if in Israel we have no intention of reaching an agreement, we don't want to make the compromises that would be necessary for agreement, then okay, you don't want Abu Mazen. Who needs Abu Mazen? So you've got Hamas, you've got radicals, you've got extremists. It's very easy to get public support against a group like Hamas, and I am against a group like Hamas. If we do really see a need to reach an agreement and to make the compromises that are necessary, then, of course, this situation is totally unsatisfactory.
That's exactly the opposite. The fact that Mahmoud Abbas is not willing to make the compromises needed to reach an agreement with Israel, and he's not. He, as a matter of fact, he gave up the negotiating table as a tool to achieve his political goals, makes it even more absurd the thought that we will sacrifice soldiers of the IDF in order to enthrone him over Gaza.
Ali, I do want to ask you, though, what Hamas sees out of this. Do they understand that maybe the Israeli cabinet and Israeli public is debating between, something that Dani is saying, that Hamas should be out of the political sphere completely, or Hamas should be contained because we don't know what's going to come out?
Hamas' assumption for the moment is that the Israeli current government doesn't want to get rid of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, because Hamas is kind of insurance for the Israeli current politics that say that there is no chance to reach a political agreement, and it would be better to present the Palestinians as divided between Gaza and between in the West Bank. So the desperation of Hamas will oblige the Israeli government to talk politics, and the Israeli government is not ready to talk politics, because when Prime Minister Netanyahu will talk seriously politics with Abu Mazen, he will need to see a reshuffle in its own government. The Bennett won't be there. Lieberman threat that in case of a serious political process, he will reconsider its place in the government. So this is why Hamas, for the moment, believes that Israel is not ready to eradicate him from the Gazan scene and from the Palestinian scene, and that Hamas is a kind of insurance for the current Israeli government. The problem is that when we went into this confrontation, I said the following. I said that Hamas was in its weakest and most isolated position since its foundation, Yael, in 1987. The Iranian money is no there. The Syrian and support was no more there. The Egyptian Brotherhood disappeared from the Egyptian arena, and Hamas was so much isolated. Its treasury was almost empty, and this round of confrontation was his only chance to regain some popularity.
And has it even now?
It has gained some popularity. Now, if Hamas, and you know that in these kind of violent circles, I assure you that no matter what the IDF will do in the coming days, Hamas will shoot the last rocket, and the last rocket will target Tel Aviv, and it will enable Hamas to say that in spite of 20 days or 30 days or 40 days of Israeli operation, we were able to target Tel Aviv even in the last days. Of course, the numbers of Israeli soldiers that contradictory, the Israeli public opinion is still strong in the Palestinian eyes. Reaching this number of Israeli soldiers will allow Hamas to regain some of its popularity among some parts of the
and what about
Palestinian...
Mahmoud Abbas's popularity? Is it waning or decreasing as the operation continues?
The problem is that between the alternatives of Hamas and the Israeli position, Mahmoud Abbas is seen as somebody who has no role for the moment to play. He is calling for negotiations, and both Hamas and the Israeli government do not for the moment believe in these negotiations. This is why the Palestinian people is between two worst alternatives.
Right.
They don't believe that Mahmoud Abbas can deliver because of the Israeli position, and they don't believe that Hamas alternative is the future.
Right.
I may add that the changes that this operation that seemingly was inconsequential at first made in the Israeli psyche, in the Israeli public opinion, you cannot underestimate them. I think that the fact that we saw the Ben Gurion airport virtually closed for 48 hours
right.
because of a rocket launched from Gaza, that I think that this is an experience will not be easily forgotten by the Israeli public when it will come to make decisions concerning Judea and Samaria, that it's, of course, is barely 5 miles from the Ben Gurion airport.
We're going to get a quick report from our I-24 news reporter, Michal Divon. Michal, you spoke to someone you're speaking to someone now with a resident of Nir Am, of course, a community surrounding the Gaza Strip.
I'm standing here in the Nir Am kibbutz. It's one of the closest communities to the Gaza border. Just a few days ago, a tunnel opening was found not far from here. And as you can imagine, residents living in this area are under an immediate threat. I'm joined by Micha, one of the residents of this community who stayed here despite the high alert and security precautions. Hi, Micha. What does it feel like being here these days?
Well, it's not that different than the experience we have had during the last 14 years as far as Qassam rockets being launching on Nir Am. It's different since the discovery of the tunnels not far away, which gives really another dimension to the whole conflict in this part of the region.
Now, there's a one-sided ceasefire at this time. However, sirens continue to be heard throughout Israel, in the south and in the center. What are your feelings about this?
Well, I think that Israel is. I agree with Israel's decision to declare a ceasefire. I think Israel can bear it for a few hours or even a day. Most of the people are well protected, and this could give an advantage to Israel politically, internationally.
Did you ever consider leaving Nir Am because of the situation here?
No, I never considered leaving Nir Am. I've been here for 50 years. My wife was born here, and this is my home. Here we raised our children here. We had times of peace, now more difficult times, but basically I think that there's an importance for people staying here along the border with Gaza, and this is my home.
And last question: what would you like to see achieved in this operation?
Well, in the long run, I would like really to achieve a more some kind of a peace agreement or a long-term lasting ceasefire. At this stage, I think the tunnels are a real threat, and Israel should use the time to destroy most of them, if not all of them. But I don't think the war should last much longer.
Thank you. I-24 News correspondent Michal Divon there, of course, on the Israeli-Gaza border in the community of Nir Am. Professor Golan, taking it back to where we stand today, diplomatically, Kerry has left the region, and we are faced with a continuing operation. The IDF decided to continue firing on the Gaza Strip due to Hamas's rejection of the ceasefire. What is your assessment, or what needs to happen in order to get the diplomatic ceasefire back on the table?
Well, both Israel and Hamas rejected the ceasefire. Each one is unhappy with the conditions. Right. I don't even know what all the conditions were.
But Israel did accept the UN humanitarian ceasefire.
No, the humanitarian ceasefire is a different story, because there Israel can go on with the tunnels, against the tunnels, and from that point of view, it's a very good idea, both in terms of international relations and militarily. But which is, of course, what Hamas understood, which is why it doesn't want it. But in any case, it is very bleak. This situation certainly isn't good if Kerry has given up on the diplomatic side. I don't think the diplomatic efforts will stop. Certainly, locally, they will continue. When I say locally, I mean, of course, Abu Mazen and the Egyptians, Qatar, Turkey, so on and so forth. Ultimately, by the way, I think America will have to be involved, because America in many ways represents Israel's interests in all of this. There's nobody else really representing them. Egypt has got this middle game, which is not always easy to understand. But I think there's tremendous pressure outside, certainly, to reach an end to this particular stage of the conflict. And while Egypt may say, okay, go on a little bit, I don't think this can go on terribly much longer. But it is really ultimately going to be a question of how Israel feels in terms of what it's accomplished on the ground, and what Hamas feels it's accomplished, mainly internationally and, of course, amongst the Palestinian public.
On the street. Dani, what needs to happen in terms of the Israeli Security Cabinet? We knew that at the beginning of the operation it was a pretty much unanimous Security Cabinet. Now we know exactly which ministers are voting against the ceasefire and which are more critical.
Well, I'm not sure. I understand that the rejection of Kerry's proposal, informal proposal, was unanimous. Regarding the discrepancies were regarding the humanitarian ceasefire.
But the future of the operation is still up for discussion.
I believe that Israel will keep on going until it's satisfied with the tunnels issue by its own hands. And then I suppose that if the Americans adopt a formula or go back to a formula that says there is a trade-off between disarmament and lifting the blockade, then we have a possibility of a ceasefire. Otherwise, I do not rule out the possibility of an unwanted military escalation that will bring the Israeli tanks to the central square of Gaza.
Even at the cost of course, more Israeli soldiers' lives?
Yes, when there are vital interests, that of course is a consideration, but it's not the ultimate consideration.
Okay, with us also in studio is I-24 News correspondent Gabi Tartakovsky. Gabi, you're here with some headlines from the Israeli media and, of course, the world media regarding Operation Protective Edge, things that we haven't spoken about this morning thus far. What are you starting with?
I'll start with the Jerusalem Post reporting Turkey citing ceasefire lifts Israel flight ban. Now, the Turkish Aviation Authority had announced the flight ban to Israel on Tuesday and repeatedly extended it throughout the weekend. But since the ceasefire came into effect, they announced the ban over Israel Ben Gurion Airport has been lifted. Now, on Friday night alone, more than 1,000 Israeli passengers were still stranded in Turkey because of the flight ban. And since Thursday, more than 3,000 Israeli passengers made it to Israel finally through specially chartered flights by Israeli airlines El Al and Arkia. So things are gradually getting back to normal regarding aviation and people wanting to go with their vacations as originally planned. Now, the Times of Israel reports about a very controversial remarks made by the son of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Yasser Abbas calls the IDF, quote, a Nazi army. Yasser Abbas said in a recent interview to Palestinian TV, Israel, and I quote, can defend itself with tanks, planes, and Iron Dome. But what about us? Israel is shooting at civilians' homes. That's a crime. Israel is behaving like the Nazis, and the IDF, and I quote, is a Nazi army.
Yes, he wasn't prepped by Abbas as a spokesperson before.
No, they have their differences. Yasser Abbas, contrary to his father Mahmoud Abbas, said that Palestine should have one capital. That's Jerusalem, and it's not the two-state solution that Mahmoud Abbas is allegedly pushing towards. Also, but he's still a very obedient son. Mahmoud Abbas called for Palestinians to donate blood to give to the various casualties during Protective Edge, and Yasser Abbas gave these remarks while donating blood in a Palestinian hospital.
So he knows the PR as well. No.
Yes. Giving blood is always a photo opportunity.
Exactly.
You can't pass on.
There you go. What else do you have?
Walla reports a very interesting story. IDF reserve soldiers' car was repossessed while serving in Gaza. Yes.
You can't win it all.
You can't win it all, and Israel's debt collection agency doesn't stop at nothing. Their officials were instructed in a recent memo to show some compassion and refinement during this operation, but still a debt collector came all the way to repossess a car to a family living in the West Bank. And it gets better. The reserve soldier's wife, the soldier is currently in Gaza. His wife is 7 months pregnant. She begged the debt collector that her husband is now serving in Gaza, that the car is actually owned by his father, and he's not been living in Israel in the past decade, and she must use the car since she is pregnant and lives in a remote area in the West Bank. She was so upset by the fact that they took her car that she was forced to rush to the hospital for another series of checkups. And the Israel Debt Collection Agency then stated, if the family had bothered to properly change ownership, the agency would not have been forced to take action. This is a cynical abuse of the current security situation and the recent guidelines issued by the agency. The family can only blame itself.
Well, at least we know other agencies are working while everyone else is, of course, in wartime.
Yes,
what else do you have?
Back on Twitter, Khamenei answers 9 key questions. Why should and how can Israel be eliminated? Yes, on Saturday, Q&A with Khamenei. The starting point of this Q&A is, and I quote, the only means to end Israeli crimes is the elimination of this regime. Now, how this Israeli regime can be eliminated? Well, Khamenei proposes that all original people of Palestine, regarding all faith, it could be Muslims, Jews, and Christians, should take part in a referendum, excluding Jewish immigrants. The new government will decide whether the Jewish immigrants should stay in Palestine or should be returned to their homelands. Now, what happens until such a referendum takes place? He says a powerful confrontation and armed resistance is the cure for this reunionist regime. Now, what solutions are not acceptable according to Khamenei? They do not recommend a classic war involving all Muslim states' armies.
Okay.
And good news, not throwing Jews at sea. So that old fear can be left aside.
How popular was this tweet on Twitter, I'm afraid?
It was retweeted and several times, and people did answer and questioned about section number 5, section number 6.
They wanted clarifications.
They want clarifications. People are growing impatient whether this will be a true referendum or just an end to means.
And quickly next?
Quickly, Joanne Rivers gives us...
Joanne Rivers, yeah, we saw that one.
Gives us a taste of Israeli public diplomacy. Let's take a look.
Let's take a look. We're getting a little trouble.
Okay.
Basically, Joan Rivers, of course, is a veteran entertainment reporter, and she's her own establishment, really, in the United States.
Yes, and she's known for speaking her mind. And she was approached by a TMZ reporter at the LA International Airport, and he approached her asking about her views regarding the recent conflict. And she likened the conflict to the rivalry between New York and New Jersey, and said if New Jersey was bombing New York and there were tunnels all the way from New Jersey to New York, we would wipe New Jersey out.
So you can see, of course, the animosity between New York and New Jersey is being compared to Israel and Hamas. That goes. That's taking the analogy just a bit far. Let's take a look at it.
If New Jersey were firing rockets into New York, we would wipe them out. I am so bored. If we heard they were digging tunnels from New Jersey to New York, we would get rid of Jersey. So I don't want to hear anymore. Oh, we'll do a partial truce. The Palestinians, you cannot throw rockets and expect people not to defend themselves.
What about the civilian casualty rate?
Then don't put your goddamn things in private homes.
It's important to note she goes after Selena Gomez, an American teen star, of course.
Yes, when the TMZ reporter said, well, Selena Gomez tweeted Free Palestine, how about that? She said, oh, Selena Gomez, that college graduate.
Yeah, and proceeded to say that Selena doesn't know how to spell Palestine. We're going to stop here. Thank you, Gabi Tartakovsky, for coming, as usual, with nice headlines from around the world. Some are funnier than others. Some are, of course... reminiscent of what's going on here. Dani Dayan, former Yesha Council chairman, thank you for joining us. Professor Gali Golan of the IDC, thank you for joining us. We're going to end here our broadcast. Just to update quickly that the economic minister, Naftali Bennett, has written on Facebook, no ceasefires, no remissions, no discussions. You have our phone number. When you're ready for disarmament, give us a call. We'll be back tomorrow.